When HOA President Margaret Thornfield pointed a loaded gun at my 8-year-old daughter over sidewalk chalk art, she thought she was dealing with just another family she could terrorize into leaving. She had no idea I was an FBI agent who'd been documenting her racist harassment for months. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching, also like and subscribe for more stories. The gavel slammed down like thunder in the small community center that served as our HOA courtroom. The sound echoed off the cheap paneled walls, mixing with the hushed whispers of our neighbors who had come to witness what Margaret Thornfield called the final solution to the Rodriguez problem. My heart pounded as I watched my 8-year-old daughter Emma clutch her stuffed bunny tighter, her innocent brown eyes wide with confusion and fear. She didn't understand why we were here, why the angry woman at the front kept pointing at our house photos and shouting about property values and community standards. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across the faces of people I had once considered friends. Mrs. Chun from 2 houses down wouldn't meet my eyes. The Johnsons, who had borrowed our lawn mower just last month, sat rigid in their chairs, afraid to show any support. Fear ruled this room, and Margaret Thornfield was its queen. I had been in hostile environments before, drug dens, terrorist cells, organized crime meetings, but this felt different. This was personal. This was about my family, my innocent daughter who had never hurt anyone in her short life. The irony wasn't lost on me that the most dangerous situation I'd faced in years was happening in a suburban community center decorated with faded inspirational posters and a dusty American flag. Margaret Thornfield, the HOA president, stood like a vulture in her black pantsuit, her silver hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a perpetual scowl. At 62, she had been terrorizing this neighborhood for 8 years, ever since her husband's promotion had made them the wealthiest family in our middle-class community. For 3 months, she had made our lives hell over a simple chalk art drawing Emma had made on our driveway, a colorful rainbow with the words, "Welcome home, Daddy," that my daughter had created the day I returned from a difficult undercover assignment. But the harassment had started long before Emma's innocent artwork. It began the day we moved in, when Margaret appeared at our door with a clipboard and a list of suggestions for making our property more appropriate for the neighborhood character. Our mailbox was too ethnic-looking, she said. The small Mexican flag my wife had planted in our flower bed was unnecessarily provocative. The Spanish music playing softly from our backyard during my daughter's birthday party was inconsiderate to neighbors who prefer peace and quiet. Each complaint was delivered with a smile that never reached her cold blue eyes. Each criticism was wrapped in language that sounded reasonable on the surface but carried an unmistakable message. "You don't belong here, Mr. Rodriguez." Margaret's voice cut through the air like a blade, dripping with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of a shoe. "Your family has repeatedly and flagrantly violated HOA regulations. Tonight this circus ends." The word circus stung. Our life, our attempts to build a home in this community, reduced to entertainment for her twisted sense of authority. I kept my expression neutral, my FBI training helping me maintain composure even as rage boiled beneath the surface. Margaret didn't know what I did for a living. To her, I was just another resident she could bully into submission, another family she could drive away with her systematic campaign of harassment. She had no idea she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. I glanced at Emma, who was trying so hard to be brave. She wore her favorite purple dress, the one with small flowers that she called her courthouse dress, because it made her feel grown up and important. The fact that my 8-year-old daughter had a courthouse dress broke my heart in ways I couldn't fully process. "The chalk washed away with the first rain," I said calmly, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. My daughter was expressing her love for her father who had been away for 6 months on business. "She's 8 years old, Mrs. Thornfield. She was welcoming me home." "Business." Margaret spat the word like it tasted foul. "Yes, we've all wondered exactly what kind of business keeps you away for months at a time. Very convenient, these mysterious absences. Very suspicious." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Around the room, I could see neighbors shifting uncomfortably, some nodding along with Margaret's insinuation. They thought I was a criminal. A drug dealer, maybe, or some other kind of lowlife who didn't deserve to live among their respectability. If only they knew I had spent those 6 months infiltrating a domestic terrorism cell, gathering evidence that would prevent attacks on schools and churches. If only they knew I had missed my daughter's first school play, her first lost tooth, months of bedtime stories and weekend pancakes, all to keep families like theirs safe from people who would hurt them. Love doesn't excuse lawlessness. Margaret slammed her hand on the podium with such force that several people jumped. "We have rules for a reason. Standards that make this community what it is. Your daughter's little art project was visible from the street for 3 whole days. 3 days of our property values dropping because you people can't control your children. You people." The mask was slipping now, revealing the ugly truth underneath all the talk about property values and community standards. This had never been about chalk or roses or mailbox heights. This was about a woman who couldn't stand seeing a Latino family living in what she considered her domain. Emma's lower lip trembled at the harsh words. She didn't fully understand the racist undertones, but she could feel the hatred radiating from Margaret like heat from a furnace. My protective instincts flared as I watched my daughter, my brave little girl who had waited 6 months for me to come home from my assignment, who had spent countless nights asking Mommy when Daddy would be back, who had drawn that rainbow with tears of joy in her eyes, shrink into herself under this woman's vicious attack. The woman didn't even know my daughter's name. 3 months of harassment, and she had never once bothered to learn that the child she was terrorizing was called Emma, that she loved art and animals and had nightmares about monsters but was learning to be brave. To Margaret, Emma was just another obstacle to be removed. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, her voice rising with each word as she warmed to her performance, "I have documentation of 14 separate violations over the past 3 months. The roses your wife planted were the wrong shade of pink, clearly stated in Section 4.2 of our landscaping guidelines that only dusty rose or blush pink flowers are acceptable. Your mailbox exceeds regulation height by 3 inches. Your daughter's bicycle was left on the lawn for 47 minutes last Tuesday afternoon, creating an unsightly mess that neighbors complained about." 47 minutes. She had actually timed how long Emma's bike sat on our grass while she came inside for lunch and to use the bathroom. The pettiness was breathtaking in its cruelty. I imagined Margaret standing at her window with a stopwatch, waiting for any excuse to add another violation to her growing list. "Your garbage cans were visible from the street on Thursday at 6:47 p.m., a full 13 minutes after the allowable time. Your outdoor Christmas lights remained up until January 3rd, 3 days beyond the December 31st deadline. And don't get me started on the noise violations, children laughing and playing in their own backyard during designated quiet hours. Children laughing." She had actually written up my family for the sound of my daughter's joy. The complete absence of humanity in that complaint took my breath away. What kind of person hears a child's laughter and thinks, violation, instead of life? "This family is a cancer on our community," Margaret declared to the packed room of neighbors, her voice carrying the fervor of someone who truly believed in her own righteousness. "They bring chaos where we have order, noise where we have peace, disorder where we have maintained pristine standards for decades." Some nodded in agreement, the Hendersons who had always been Margaret's allies and the Coopers who were afraid of becoming her next target. Others looked uncomfortable but remained silent, their moral cowardice keeping them locked in their seats. Fear of becoming Margaret's next target kept them silent, complicit in their inaction. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who sometimes brought Emma cookies, looked like she wanted to speak but kept glancing nervously at Margaret. I realized in that moment that Margaret had successfully terrorized the entire neighborhood. Every family here lived in fear of her arbitrary rules, her midnight patrols, her measuring tape and her camera. They had all chosen the path of least resistance, sacrificing justice for peace, allowing one family to be destroyed so that they could maintain their own fragile safety. I moved for immediate fines totaling $15,000 and mandatory relocation within 30 days, Margaret announced with the satisfaction of someone delivering a death blow. This community will no longer tolerate their presence. $15,000. 30 days. The numbers hit me like physical blows. Margaret was trying to financially destroy my family and force us from our home. The home where Emma had taken her first steps, where my wife had planted a garden, where we had built a life filled with love and hope. I felt my carefully maintained control begin to crack like ice under pressure. Emma wasn't just scared now, she was terrified. Her small body shook against my leg as she tried to process the adult anger swirling around her. She tugged on my sleeve with her tiny hand, her touch gentle and desperate. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of voices discussing our destruction. "Did I make you and Mommy in trouble? I just wanted to make something pretty for when you came home. I missed you so much and the rainbow had all your favorite colors." The guilt in her voice shattered something inside me that I didn't know could break. This innocent child, who had spent months counting days on her calendar until Daddy came home, who had carefully chosen each color for that rainbow because she remembered that I liked bright things that made me smile, thought she had caused this nightmare. The pure love behind that chalk drawing, a love so strong it had compelled her to create something beautiful on the cold concrete of our driveway, had been twisted into something shameful by Margaret's hatred. Margaret heard Emma's whispered question and smiled, actually smiled, at my daughter's distress. The expression was predatory, satisfied, like a cat that had successfully cornered a mouse. "Perhaps next time you'll think twice before defacing community property, little girl," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sweetness that made my skin crawl. That was the moment I knew there would be no peaceful resolution. Margaret had just declared war on my family, and more importantly, she had targeted my child. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Mrs. Thornfield," I said, standing slowly, my voice carrying a new edge that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably. "Are you threatening my daughter?" "I'm educating her about consequences," Margaret replied smugly. "Something you've clearly failed to do as a parent." The room fell silent. Even the ticking of the wall clock seemed to pause. I felt that familiar coldness settle over me, the same detachment that had served me well in countless dangerous situations. Margaret had just made this personal. "I see," I said quietly. "And you believe this behavior is appropriate for someone in your position?" "I believe in maintaining standards," she snapped. "Something people like you wouldn't understand." "People like me." The casual racism wasn't even subtle anymore. I glanced around the room, noting the positions of exits, the layout of furniture, the faces of everyone present. Old habits from my training, but tonight they felt necessary. "Daddy, I'm scared," Emma whispered, pressing closer to my leg. I knelt down and gently touched her face, wiping away a tear I hadn't noticed fall. "It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy's going to handle this." But as I stood back up, Margaret was reaching into her purse. The motion was quick, practiced, and immediately familiar to someone with my background. My blood turned to ice as I saw the black grip of a pistol emerge from her designer handbag. "Maybe this will help you understand how serious I am about maintaining order in this community," Margaret said, her voice steady but her hands shaking slightly as she pointed the weapon in our general direction. "Your kind needs to learn respect." Screams erupted throughout the room as neighbors scrambled for cover. Chairs overturned, papers scattered, and panic filled the air. But I wasn't moving. I was calculating distances, angles, threat assessment. My daughter was behind me and I was between her and the gun. "Margaret, put the weapon down," I said, my voice carrying absolute authority now. The tone I used when identifying myself to suspects, when taking control of dangerous situations. "You're making a mistake you can't take back." "The only mistake was letting your family move into our neighborhood," she snarled, the gun wavering but still pointed toward us. "You people bring down everything you touch." Emma was sobbing now, clutching my leg so tightly I could feel her small fingernails through my pants. The sound of my daughter's terror ignited something primal in me, not just the trained federal agent, but the father whose child was being threatened by an armed racist with delusions of power. "Last chance, Margaret," I said, slowly reaching for my badge. "Put the gun down." "What are you going to do?" She laughed, a high, hysterical sound. "Call the police? I am the authority here. I decide who belongs and who doesn't." I flipped open my federal credentials, holding them high enough for everyone in the room to see. "FBI Special Agent Marcus Rodriguez. You are pointing a firearm at a federal officer and his minor child. Lower your weapon immediately." The change in Margaret's expression was instantaneous. The smugness evaporated, replaced by confusion, then growing horror as the implications sank in. The gun in her hand suddenly felt heavier, more real. Around the room, neighbors who had been cowering began to straighten, phones appearing as they started recording what was clearly about to become a very public downfall. That's not possible," Margaret stammered, the gun beginning to shake more violently in her grip. You work from home, you're just what, Margaret?" I asked, taking a slow step forward. "Just not what you expected? Just not fitting your narrow worldview? Just someone you thought you could bully because you made assumptions based on my name and appearance?" The truth was written across her face. She had profiled me from day one, decided I was somehow beneath her, someone she could intimidate and control. The federal badge in my hand shattered that delusion completely. "I've been documenting everything," I continued, my voice growing colder with each word. "Every racist comment, every targeted harassment, every attempt to force my family from our legally purchased home. Do you know what we call that at the Bureau, Margaret? We call it a hate crime." Emma's crying had quieted to small hiccups as she pressed against my leg. She could sense the shift in power, the way the adult voices had changed. Margaret's gun was still pointed in our direction, but now it looked less like a threat and more like the desperate action of someone who realized they had destroyed their own life. The chalk was just the beginning, I said, reaching slowly into my jacket. Margaret tensed, but I only pulled out my phone. Let me tell you what I've really been doing these past 3 months while you've been playing petty dictator. I held up my phone, showing a screen full of recorded conversations, photographs, video files. Every threatening voicemail you left my wife while I was away on assignment. Every time you followed my daughter around the neighborhood with your measuring tape and clipboard. Every racist comment you made to other neighbors about those people bringing down property values. Margaret's face had gone white. The gun trembled so badly now I was genuinely concerned she might accidentally discharge it. Did you know, I continued conversationally, that when you key someone's car in a neighborhood with federal housing, that becomes destruction of federal property? Did you know that when you mail threatening letters to the home of a federal agent, that's considered intimidation of a federal officer? Because I have security cameras, Margaret. I have everything. The room was dead silent except for Emma's soft sniffles and the sound of Margaret's labored breathing. Other residents were recording everything now, phones held high, knowing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. But the gun, Margaret, I said, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Pointing a loaded firearm at a federal agent and his child in front of 40 witnesses. That's not just a hate crime anymore. That's not just harassment. That's attempted murder of a federal officer. That's domestic terrorism. Those last 2 words hit her like physical blows. Domestic terrorism. In the current political climate, those words carried weight that could destroy not just her freedom, but her entire family's future. Her husband's government job, her children's college prospects, their social standing, all of it would crumble. I wasn't going to. She began, but her voice failed her. You pulled a gun on an 8-year-old child, I said, and now my careful control was slipping, letting some of my rage show through. You pointed a loaded weapon at my daughter because she drew with sidewalk chalk. Because she wanted to welcome her daddy home. Emma looked up at me with those big brown eyes, still not fully understanding but sensing that something important was happening. Are you really FBI, Daddy? She asked in a small voice. Yes, sweetheart, I said, never taking my eyes off Margaret. Daddy catches bad people who hurt others. Like the mean lady? The innocence of the question, the simple clarity of a child's worldview, seemed to echo through the silent room. Margaret was indeed the mean lady. The bully who had terrorized a family for months, who had pointed a gun at a little girl over chalk art. Yes, baby, I said softly. Like the mean lady. Margaret's resolve finally cracked completely. The gun fell from her shaking hands, clattering onto the floor. She collapsed into her chair, the weight of her actions crushing down on her all at once. Around the room, neighbors who had remained silent during months of harassment were now pulling out their phones, no longer afraid to document Margaret's downfall. I didn't know, she whispered, but we all knew that wasn't really the point. She hadn't needed to know my profession to treat my family with basic human decency. She hadn't needed special credentials to see that terrorizing a child over chalk art was wrong. I picked up the fallen weapon, safely clearing it with practiced efficiency while simultaneously calling for backup on my phone. My voice was all business as I spoke to the dispatcher, rattling off codes and requesting both local police and federal agents to the scene. Emma, I said, kneeling down to my daughter's level while keeping one eye on Margaret, I need you to go sit with Mrs. Patterson over there, okay? The nice lady with the cookies who always waves at you. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had been one of the few neighbors to show kindness to my family, immediately opened her arms for Emma. As my daughter walked across the room, every person present watched her. This brave little girl who had been through more in one evening than most children experience in years. Within minutes, the room was filled with uniforms. Local police, FBI agents from my field office, even federal marshals appeared as word spread through law enforcement channels that shots had been fired near a federal agent's family. Margaret was placed in handcuffs while her rights were read, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. But the story didn't end there. As the investigation unfolded over the following weeks, the full scope of Margaret's actions came to light. The Federal Bureau of Investigation doesn't take threats against its agents' families lightly, especially when those threats cross into hate crime territory. Margaret had kept meticulous records of her harassment campaign, apparently believing she was building a legal case against my family. Instead, she had created a perfect paper trail of her own criminal behavior. The evidence was overwhelming. Recorded phone calls where she used racial slurs. Emails to other neighbors encouraging them to make my family feel unwelcome. Security footage of her damaging our property. A notebook where she had tracked my family's daily activities with disturbing detail. Most damning of all were the communications with several other HOA board members where she outlined plans to make life so miserable for those people that they'll have no choice but to leave. The case made national news within days, but it was the video footage from that night that truly captured the public's attention. HOA president pulls gun on FBI agent's 8-year-old daughter became a headline that sparked conversations about racism, abuse of power, and the dangers of unchecked authority in homeowner associations. The footage, recorded by multiple neighbors, went viral across social media platforms with unprecedented speed. The video showed everything: Margaret's racist comments, Emma's innocent confusion, my calm attempts at de-escalation, and the shocking moment when a loaded weapon was pointed at a child over chalk art. But what resonated most with viewers was Emma herself. Her bravery, her confusion, her whispered apologies for something that was never her fault. Within hours, #JusticeForEmma was trending nationally. Legal experts appeared on news programs to explain the various federal charges Margaret faced. Child psychologists discussed the trauma of experiencing racist harassment at such a young age. Civil rights leaders used our story to illustrate the everyday reality of discrimination that many families face. But perhaps most importantly, other families began coming forward with their own stories of HOA abuse. The case opened floodgates of complaints about similar harassment campaigns, discriminatory enforcement of rules, and the ways that homeowner associations had become vehicles for exclusion and intimidation. Congressional hearings were announced to examine HOA oversight and regulation. Margaret faced federal charges including intimidation of a federal officer, brandishing a firearm in commission of a hate crime, attempted assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to violate civil rights, stalking, and domestic terrorism. Each charge carried significant prison time, and the federal prosecutors made it clear they intended to seek the maximum sentence to send a message about protecting civil rights and the safety of federal agents' families. Her husband, Richard, a mid-level State Department employee, was placed on administrative leave pending a security clearance review. The investigation revealed that he had not only known about his wife's activities but had used his government access to obtain some of the background information she had collected on our family. His career was effectively over, his pension in jeopardy, his reputation destroyed. Their 2 adult children found themselves defending their family name in their respective workplaces and social circles. Margaret's daughter, a high school teacher, faced calls for her resignation from parents who questioned whether someone raised in such a household could fairly educate children of color. Her son, a junior associate at a prestigious law firm, was quietly asked to take a leave of absence while the firm assessed the impact on their reputation. The entire Thornfield family, which had once been among the most prominent in our community, became pariahs overnight. Their country club memberships were revoked. Their longtime friends stopped returning calls. Their children's families were no longer welcome at neighborhood gatherings. They had become what they had tried to make us, unwanted outsiders in their own community. The HOA itself faced a massive federal investigation. Records were seized, communications subpoenaed, and every decision made during Margaret's tenure was scrutinized for evidence of discriminatory practices. What investigators found was a pattern of harassment targeting families of color, single mothers, and anyone who didn't fit Margaret's vision of the ideal neighborhood demographic. 3 other board members were arrested on related charges. The entire HOA structure was dissolved by court order, and a federal monitor was appointed to oversee the community's governance until new fair leadership could be established. Property values that Margaret had claimed to protect actually increased once the toxic leadership was removed and the neighborhood became known as a place where families were actually welcome. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came 6 months later, during Margaret's sentencing hearing. The federal courtroom was packed with supporters, neighbors who had finally found their courage, other families who had experienced similar harassment, civil rights advocates, and law enforcement colleagues who wanted to show solidarity with one of their own. Emma, now 9 and remarkably resilient thanks to months of counseling and the unwavering support of her family and community, had asked if she could speak to the judge. Against my initial instincts as a protective father, but following the advice of our victim's advocate and Emma's child psychologist, I agreed to let her have her say. My daughter had earned the right to be heard. The courtroom fell silent as Emma walked to the witness stand. She wore her favorite yellow dress, not the purple courthouse dress from that terrible night, but a bright, cheerful one that reflected the healing that had taken place in our family. She looked tiny in the large federal courtroom, dwarfed by the mahogany and marble, but her voice was clear and strong when she spoke. "Your Honor," she began, using the formal address we had practiced together, "I just wanted to say that I forgive Mrs. Margaret for being mean to me and my family. My daddy taught me that holding on to anger makes your heart heavy, and I don't want a heavy heart. I want to keep space in my heart for good things, like drawing and my friends and my family." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even Margaret, who had maintained a defiant stance throughout most of the proceedings, was visibly crying. The federal marshals, hardened law enforcement officers who had seen every kind of human tragedy, were wiping their eyes. Even the stern federal judge seemed to struggle with composure. In the large courtroom, but her voice was clear and strong when she spoke. "Your Honor," she began, using the formal address we had practiced, "I just wanted to say that I forgive Mrs. Margaret for being mean to me and my family. My daddy taught me that holding on to anger makes your heart heavy, and I don't want a heavy heart." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even Margaret, who had maintained a defiant stance throughout most of the proceedings, was visibly crying. "But," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm, "I also want other kids to know that it's not okay for grown-ups to be mean to them just because they're different or because they look different or talk different. My daddy says that his job is to protect kids like me from people who want to hurt us because of what we look like or where our families come from." She paused, looking around the courtroom with the confidence of a child who had learned that her voice mattered, that adults would listen when she spoke truth. "Mrs. Margaret was scared of me and my family because we were different from her. But different doesn't mean bad. Different means we bring new colors to the world. Like when I mix paints to make a sunset. You need lots of different colors to make something beautiful." The metaphor was perfect, devastating in its simplicity. A 9-year-old had articulated what adults struggled to explain. That diversity strengthens rather than weakens communities, that fear of difference is ultimately fear of beauty itself. She looked directly at Margaret then, with no fear in her bright brown eyes, only sadness for someone who had chosen hatred over understanding. "I hope you learn to be nicer to people, Mrs. Margaret. Maybe when you get out of jail you can try drawing with chalk. It's really fun and it makes the world more colorful. I could teach you how to draw rainbows if you want to learn." The offer of friendship from the child she had terrorized was the final, devastating blow to any remaining sympathy for Margaret Thornfield. Here was a 9-year-old offering art lessons to the woman who had pointed a gun at her, demonstrating a grace and forgiveness that exposed the poverty of Margaret's soul. The judge sentenced Margaret to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and mandatory community service working with organizations that combat hate crimes. She would also be required to pay full restitution for all legal fees, property damage and emotional distress caused to my family and others she had targeted. As we left the courthouse that day, Emma skipping beside me with her characteristic resilience, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. What started as a simple chalk drawing, a child's expression of love and welcome, had exposed a cancer of hatred and bigotry that had been poisoning our community for years. Margaret's downfall had sent ripples far beyond our neighborhood. HOA reforms were implemented across the state, with new oversight requirements and anti-discrimination training. My story was used in FBI training seminars about recognizing and responding to domestic terrorism threats. Most importantly, other families who had been silently suffering under similar harassment found the courage to speak out and seek justice. Emma never stopped drawing with chalk. Our new driveway, we had moved to a larger house in a truly welcoming neighborhood, was regularly decorated with rainbows, flowers, hopscotch courts, and messages of welcome for anyone who visited. The difference was that now, neighbors often joined her, creating a colorful community art project that brought people together instead of driving them apart. Margaret served her full sentence. I heard through law enforcement channels that she was a model prisoner, participating in rehabilitation programs and reportedly expressing genuine remorse for her actions. Whether that remorse was sincere or simply self-serving remained to be seen. The real victory, though, was Emma herself. Despite everything she had endured, she remained the bright, loving, creative child she had always been. She grew up knowing that her father would always protect her, that her voice mattered, and that standing up to bullies, even powerful ones, was not only possible but necessary. Years later, when Emma was in high school and studying civics, she wrote an essay about that night that began, "My teacher asked us to write about a time when we learned about justice. Most kids will probably write about a movie or a book, but I learned about justice the night someone pointed a gun at me over sidewalk chalk, and my FBI agent father taught me that no one, no matter how much power they think they have, is above the law." She got an A+ on that essay. But more than that, she got something invaluable. The knowledge that when people try to make you small because of who you are, you have the right to stand tall. That love and creativity and welcome are more powerful than hate and fear. That sometimes, the most dangerous bullies are the ones who smile while they hurt you, and that it takes courage to call them out. And sometimes, just sometimes, the quiet person you're trying to bully turns out to be exactly the wrong person to mess with. Margaret learned that lesson the hard way. Emma learned it the right way. And I learned that being an FBI agent isn't just about catching criminals. Sometimes it's about being in the right place at the right time to protect the innocent and ensure that justice isn't just an ideal we talk about, but a reality we live every single day. The chalk may have washed away, but the lesson it taught our community remains permanent, colorful, and bright.